They came to hear how much of my husband's life they could take from me, but they didn't know Daniel had already left them a trap. I sat at the far end of the long walnut conference table in Mr. Collins's law office, still wearing the same simple black dress I had worn to my husband's funeral less than 24 hours earlier. The fabric felt heavy on my shoulders, not because it was expensive or formal, but because it still carried the weight of every handshake, every empty condolence, every person who had looked at me with pity and then quickly turned away. Outside the tall office windows, downtown Chicago moved like any other Tuesday morning. Cars passed below. A delivery truck backed into an alley. Somewhere, someone was probably buying coffee and checking emails and complaining about traffic. But inside that room, time felt sealed behind glass. Daniel Carter, my husband of 9 years, was gone, and his family had arrived dressed less like mourners and more like people waiting for a business deal to close. His mother, Margaret Carter, sat directly across from me in a cream-colored suit that looked too bright for a widow's mother-in-law. Her pearls rested perfectly at her throat, her silver blonde hair pinned so tightly that not a strand dared move. She had cried at the funeral, of course, but only when people were watching. Now her eyes were dry, sharp, and almost impatient. Beside her, Daniel's older brother, Bradley, kept glancing down at his phone under the table, his thumb moving quickly as if he had more important things to arrange. I caught one line on the screen when he tilted it toward the light, "After probate clears." He saw me notice and locked the phone without a word. Vanessa, Bradley's wife, sat next to him with her designer bag placed on the empty chair like it needed its own seat. She leaned close to Margaret and whispered something I couldn't hear, then looked toward me with that small, polished smile she always used when she wanted me to feel poor without saying the word. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked if I had slept. No one mentioned Daniel except as a name attached to assets, shares, signatures, properties, and accounts. I held my wedding ring between my fingers, turning it slowly, feeling the tiny groove on the inside where Daniel had engraved the words Stillus. I tried to focus on that. Not on Margaret's calm satisfaction. Not on Bradley's restless excitement. Not on Vanessa quietly talking about the Aspen house as if Daniel had simply stepped out of the room and left them the keys. Mr. Collins entered at exactly 10 a.m., carrying a leather folder and a sealed envelope marked with Daniel's initials. He had been Daniel's attorney for years, a careful man with grey hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that revealed nothing until it had to. He greeted everyone politely, then looked at me for just a moment longer than the others. There was sympathy in his eyes, but there was something else too, something guarded. He sat at the head of the table, opened the folder, and began explaining the process in a quiet, professional tone. Margaret folded her hands. Bradley straightened in his chair. Vanessa's smile grew a little wider. They thought this was the moment I would finally learn my place in the Carter family. Then Mr. Collins broke the seal on Daniel's envelope, pulled out a final document I had never seen before, and the color in his face changed just enough for me to notice. Before Mr. Collins read a single word, my mind slipped back to the first time I understood that the Carter family had never planned to make room for me. It was not at the wedding, although Margaret had worn pale silver and told 3 guests that it was close enough to white to be elegant. It was not at Thanksgiving, when Vanessa asked whether my parents still lived in that little house outside Milwaukee, as if a modest home was something contagious. It was not even the first Christmas I spent at the Carter estate, when Bradley gave Daniel a rare bottle of bourbon and gave me a department store candle with the clearance sticker still half attached. The moment I truly understood happened during a Sunday dinner at Margaret's house in Lake Forest, 3 years after Daniel and I married. The dining room had high ceilings, oil portraits, and a table long enough to make every conversation feel like a negotiation. I had spent the afternoon helping Daniel choose flowers for his mother because he still believed kindness could soften her. We arrived with white lilies, her favorite, and she accepted them without looking at me. That night, Daniel was telling everyone about a non-profit clinic I had helped organize downtown. I was proud of it. We had raised enough money to cover dental care and basic checkups for families who could not afford them, and Daniel looked at me the way he always did when he wanted the world to see what he saw. But Margaret simply set down her wineglass and said, "That is very sweet, Emily." It is always good when people remember where they came from. No one laughed, but no one defended me either, except Daniel. He reached under the table and took my hand. My wife has done more good in one weekend than most people do with a lifetime of inherited money, he said calmly. The room went silent. Bradley looked annoyed, Vanessa looked amused, and Margaret looked at our joined hands as though Daniel had embarrassed the family by loving me in public. Later, while Daniel stepped outside to take a call, I overheard Margaret and Bradley near the kitchen. They did not know I was in the hallway. Margaret said, "Daniel is sentimental. That is dangerous when there is money involved." Bradley answered, "As long as the company's shares stay protected, she can play charity wife all she wants." Then Margaret said the sentence I never forgot, "Carter wealth stays with Carter blood." I stood there with my hand on the wall, feeling the cold paint beneath my fingers, and for the first time I realized their politeness was not awkwardness. It was strategy. From that day forward, every smile had a blade behind it, every invitation came with a test, and every conversation somehow circled back to what I did not own, where I did not belong, and what I should never expect. Daniel knew more than I thought he did. He noticed when Margaret corrected the way I introduced myself. He noticed when Bradley stopped talking whenever I entered the room. He noticed when Vanessa complimented my dress by saying it was surprisingly tasteful. And every time, Daniel stood a little closer to me, as if his body could form a wall between me and the family that raised him. I used to tell him not to fight them. I told him I had survived worse than rich people with cold manners. He would smile sadly and say, "You should not have to survive my family, Em. You are my family." Back then, I thought those words were comfort. Sitting in Mr. Collins's office years later, watching Daniel's mother wait for his will to erase me, I finally understood they had also been a promise. Daniel began changing in small ways before anyone said the word terminal out loud. At first, it was easy to pretend it was just exhaustion. He had always worked too many hours, answered too many calls, carried too much of Carter Holdings on his back while Bradley enjoyed the title without the weight. But then Daniel started leaving meetings early. He stopped taking the stairs to our second-floor bedroom. Some mornings, he stood at the kitchen counter with one hand wrapped around his coffee mug and the other pressed quietly against the edge of the marble, as if he needed the house to hold him up. When the doctors finally explained the seriousness of his condition, Daniel did not fall apart in front of me. He listened, asked clear questions, wrote down every option, and thanked the specialist with the same calm courtesy he used in boardrooms. I was the one who cried in the parking garage afterward, sitting in the passenger seat while the Chicago wind shook the car. Daniel reached across the console, took my hand, and said, "We are going to handle one day at a time." That was Daniel. Even while his own future was shrinking, he was still trying to make the room feel safe for me. But illness also sharpened him. It made him notice things he had once tried to excuse. Margaret began visiting more often, bringing homemade soup she had never made herself and documents tucked neatly in leather folders. She would kiss Daniel on the forehead, ask how he was feeling, then wait until I left the room before lowering her voice. Bradley suddenly became very concerned about stability. He talked about voting shares, succession plans, family trust protections, and how outside influence could make investors nervous. By outside influence, he meant me. Vanessa sent flowers with cards that said "thinking of you both," but she never called unless Margaret needed something repeated in a softer voice. Daniel saw it all. One night, about 4 months before he died, I woke around 2 in the morning and found his side of the bed empty. The hallway was dark except for the thin blue glow coming from his study. I walked quietly to the door and saw him sitting at his desk in a robe, reading through printed emails with a yellow legal pad beside him. His face looked older in that light, not because of sickness, but because of disappointment. He did not look surprised when I knocked. He only turned one page face down and said, "I did not want to wake you." I asked him what he was doing, and for a moment he considered lying to protect me. Then he sighed and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "My mother asked Collins whether a spouse can be encouraged to disclaim inheritance rights after death," he said. Bradley asked finance to prepare a valuation that excludes you from any management interest. They are not waiting, Emily. They are planning. I remember the cold feeling that moved through me then, the awful confirmation of something I had always sensed but never wanted to name. I told Daniel we did not have to fight about money. I told him I would rather have one more peaceful month with him than years of conflict with people who never loved me. He looked at me for a long time, and his voice was gentle but firm. This is not about money. It is about what they will do to you when I am not here to stand in the doorway. After that night, Daniel started meeting privately with Mr. Collins every Thursday morning. He told Margaret it was estate maintenance. He told Bradley it was routine corporate planning. He told me only enough to keep me from being afraid, but not enough for me to carry the burden before I had to. He updated beneficiaries, separated personal assets from family-controlled structures, reviewed security footage policies, and asked Mr. Collins to preserve every written message that showed pressure, exclusion, or intent. He was not building revenge. Daniel hated revenge. He was building a wall, brick by brick, out of signatures, dates, witnesses, and law. And somewhere in those final months, while his family smiled at him with one hand open and the other reaching behind his back, my husband wrote the sentence that would one day make an entire room go silent. Daniel passed away on a grey Monday morning, just before sunrise, while the house was still quiet and the streets outside were shining from overnight rain. For a few minutes after the nurse called the time, I could not move. I sat beside him with my hand over his, feeling the strange stillness of a room that had spent months filled with machines, pill bottles, whispered updates, and cautious hope. Then everything began happening too quickly. Phone calls had to be made. Forms had to be signed. People arrived with lowered voices and careful faces. Margaret came through the front door in a black coat and paused in the foyer as if she were entering a museum, not the home where her son had taken his last breath. She touched my shoulder for less than a second and said, "You should go lie down, Emily. We will handle the family matters." The family matters. That was what Daniel became within an hour of leaving this world. Not my husband. Not the man who used to dance barefoot with me in the kitchen when it snowed. Not the person who remembered the exact way I liked my coffee and still apologized when he forgot to buy oat milk. To them, he became a file to manage, a name to control, a legacy to protect from me. The funeral took place 3 days later at a stone church in Lake Forest, the same church where Margaret had once insisted every Carter milestone belonged. Hundreds of people came. Executives, neighbors, charity board members, old college friends, men in dark suits who shook Bradley's hand before they even looked at me. Margaret stood in the receiving line beside me like a statue carved from grief and pride. Every time someone offered condolences, she lifted a tissue to eyes that had no tears left in them. Bradley gave a polished speech about Daniel's leadership, his vision, his dedication to the Carter name. He mentioned the company 6 times and me once. Vanessa wore a black dress with a veil and accepted sympathy as though she had lost something more personal than access to Daniel's orbit. I stood through it all because Daniel would have wanted dignity. I stood because if I sat down, I was afraid I would not get back up. After the burial, people gathered at our house. Not Margaret's house, not the Carter estate, but the home Daniel and I had shared for 9 years. The house where he had planted hydrangeas for me because I missed my mother's garden in Wisconsin. The house where he had marked my height on the pantry door as a joke after I teased him for being 6 feet tall and still needing a stool to reach the top shelf. The house where every room had a memory of him. Yet by 5 o'clock that afternoon, Margaret was already walking through it with Bradley, speaking in low voices about appraisals and maintenance costs. I heard Vanessa in the dining room telling someone that the Aspen property would be wasted if it stayed locked up during ski season. I stood near the kitchen island holding a glass of water I had not touched, watching them move through my life like buyers at an open house. When the last guest left and the caterers packed away the silver trays, Margaret finally stopped pretending. She placed Daniel's framed funeral photo on the console table, straightened it by ½ an inch, and turned to me. "Emily, we need to be practical now," she said. Bradley stood behind her with his arms crossed. Vanessa leaned against the doorway, silent but smiling. Margaret continued, "This house is part of Daniel's larger estate picture. Until the will is read, it would be best if you did not make any emotional decisions about property that may not remain under your control." I looked at her, too tired to answer. She took my silence as permission. "You can stay in the guest room for a few days if that is easier. But I do think you should begin packing your personal things." The word guest landed harder than any insult she had ever given me. I had been Daniel's wife in that house. I had held him through fevers in that house. I had signed mortgage documents, chosen paint colors, paid contractors, cooked birthday dinners, and slept beside him through every hard night. But in Margaret's mouth, I was already a visitor who had overstayed. Bradley added, "No one is trying to be cruel. We just want a smooth transition." Vanessa gave a soft laugh and said, "It will be easier for everyone if you do not make this dramatic." I set the glass down carefully so my hand would not shake. I wanted to tell them Daniel would be ashamed. I wanted to ask how they could stand under his roof on the day we buried him and speak to me like an inconvenience. But Daniel's voice came back to me from one of those late nights in his study, when they show you who they are, let them finish. So I said nothing. I picked up Daniel's photo, held it against my chest, and walked upstairs while they stayed below, already planning a future they believed did not include me. What they did not know was that every word they had just spoken had brought them one step closer to the very consequence Daniel had prepared for them. That night, after Margaret told me to begin packing, I sat on the edge of the guest room bed because I could not bring myself to sleep in the room where Daniel's side was empty. The guest room still had the pale blue quilt his grandmother had made, a framed photograph of Lake Michigan in winter, and a faint lavender smell from the sachets Margaret once said were more appropriate for visitors. I kept Daniel's funeral photo on the nightstand and my suitcase unopened on the floor. Downstairs, I could hear low voices moving through the house long after midnight. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Bradley's shoes crossed the hardwood near Daniel's study. Vanessa laughed once, quickly, then went quiet when someone shushed her. They were not grieving. They were inventorying. I sat still in the dark, remembering Daniel's words, "When they show you who they are, let them finish." At the time, I had thought he meant emotionally, as if silence would protect my dignity. But as the hours passed, I wondered if Daniel had meant something more precise. He had always chosen his words carefully, especially near the end. The next morning, I found a handwritten note from Margaret slipped under the guest room door. It was on her personal stationery, the kind with her initials pressed into the top in raised grey letters. "Emily," it read, "for everyone's comfort, please limit access to Daniel's office until estate matters are clarified." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Daniel's office was not a museum. It was where he had kissed me on the forehead during conference calls, where we had eaten takeout on the floor during a snowstorm, where he had kept a drawer full of birthday cards because he said handwritten love should never be thrown away. But Margaret had already made it sound like company property. I folded the note and placed it in my purse without answering. Around noon, Bradley knocked once and entered before I invited him in. He was wearing a navy quarter-zip sweater and holding a clipboard, as if casual clothing could make his behavior look less calculated. He told me he needed garage codes, safe combinations, and a list of accounts Daniel used for household expenses. I said Mr. Collins had advised me not to discuss estate details until the formal reading. Bradley's expression tightened. "Collins works for the family," he said. I looked at him and answered quietly, "Daniel hired him." For the first time, Bradley seemed irritated enough to forget his polished tone. He told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. He said no one wanted a dispute. He said I should remember that the Carter name had existed long before I married into it. Every sentence sounded like it had been rehearsed in a room where I was already the problem. That afternoon, Vanessa sent me a text message with 3 links to apartment listings in neighborhoods she called more realistic for a fresh start. One was nearly 40 miles from the house. Another was above a laundromat. The third had a note from her attached, "This might suit your lifestyle better once everything settles." I did not reply. I took a screenshot. I did not know why at the time. Maybe grief makes people preserve strange things. Maybe some part of me had learned from Daniel that words mattered, dates mattered, proof mattered. By evening, Margaret returned with a property manager I had never met and introduced him as someone who would help prepare the residence. She did not say our home. She did not say Daniel's home. She said the residence, as if love could be stripped out of a place by changing the noun. The man looked uncomfortable when he saw me standing in the hallway with Daniel's old cardigan around my shoulders. Margaret asked him to walk through the main floor and assess what would be needed before any transition of possession. I felt something inside me go very still. Not angry. Not loud. Just still. I remembered Daniel at his desk under the blue glow of his computer, turning a page face down when I entered. I remembered the weekly meetings with Mr. Collins. I remembered how Daniel had once touched the small camera above the foyer and said, almost casually, "It is amazing what people forget is recording when they think no one important is listening." At the time, I had barely noticed. Now, as Margaret stood under that same foyer camera and told the property manager I would likely be out within the week, the memory returned so sharply that I had to hold the stair railing. They thought Daniel's protection had ended when his heart stopped. They thought every cruel word after the funeral disappeared into the walls. But Daniel had known them too well for that. He had not built a trap with secrets. He had built it with their own behavior, and all they had to do was keep being exactly who they were. By the time I returned to Mr. Collins's office the next morning, the house behind me no longer felt like a home I was leaving for an appointment. It felt like a room full of witnesses waiting to speak. I had slept barely 2 hours in the guest room, with Daniel's cardigan folded beside me and Margaret's note tucked inside my purse. I had not packed a single suitcase. I had not answered Vanessa's apartment links. I had not given Bradley one code, one account number, or one signature. I simply put on the same black dress from the funeral because I did not have the strength to choose another, brushed my hair, placed Daniel's wedding ring on a thin chain around my neck, and drove into downtown Chicago while the morning traffic crawled along Lake Shore Drive. Mr. Collins's building stood between a bank and a private equity office, all glass, stone, and quiet elevators. When I stepped into the conference room, Margaret was already there. She had arrived before everyone, of course. People like Margaret believed being early was a form of ownership. She sat in the chair closest to Mr. Collins's seat, her cream suit pressed perfectly, a slim leather folder in front of her, and a pen placed straight across the top like she expected to sign something important. Bradley came in a few minutes later, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and coffee, carrying his phone in one hand and a legal pad in the other. He did not look at me when he sat down. Vanessa arrived last, wearing oversized sunglasses that she did not remove until she was inside the room. She gave me a quick glance, then leaned toward Bradley and whispered, "This should not take long." I heard her clearly. She wanted me to hear her. I sat at the far end of the table, the same place where I had sat when Mr. Collins opened Daniel's sealed envelope, and his expression shifted for half a second. No one else had noticed that change. Or if they had, they ignored it because confidence can make people blind. Mr. Collins greeted us with the same careful professionalism, then began reading the main provisions of Daniel's will. At first, everything sounded exactly the way the Carter family expected it to sound. Certain assets connected to Carter Holdings were referenced through the existing family trust. Corporate voting procedures were acknowledged. Legacy properties were named. Margaret's mouth softened into the closest thing she had to a smile. Bradley exhaled quietly and wrote something on his legal pad. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other and relaxed back in her chair, as if the room had finally confirmed what she had always believed, that I was temporary. Mr. Collins continued, listing accounts, investments, and restrictions in a calm voice that made every sentence feel final. Then he read that I would receive Daniel's personal effects, a designated cash account, and continued residence subject to estate review. Margaret looked directly at me when she heard that phrase, subject to estate review. She did not need to speak. Her eye said she had already won. Bradley tapped his pen against the table and said, "So the house remains unresolved until the trustees determine its proper treatment." Mr. Collins looked at him over the top of his glasses. "For the moment, yes." That was enough for Bradley. He leaned back, satisfied. Vanessa gave a tiny, almost graceful shrug, as if to say this was unfortunate for me but necessary for everyone else. Margaret folded her hands and finally spoke in the gentle public voice she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like guidance. "Emily, Daniel was sentimental, but he also understood responsibility. I hope you can respect the structure he left behind." I looked at the woman who had told me to pack hours after her son's funeral, the brother who had searched for codes before the ground settled over Daniel's grave, the sister-in-law who had sent me apartment listings like a farewell gift. I wanted to ask whether any of them remembered his laugh. I wanted to ask whether they knew he always warmed his hands around a mug before difficult conversations. But I stayed silent because Mr. Collins had not closed the folder. He turned one more page. The paper made a soft sound against the table, small enough that anyone could have missed it, but to me it sounded like a door unlocking. Margaret's smile remained for one more second, Bradley was still looking at his notes, and Vanessa was already checking her phone. None of them saw Mr. Collins place Daniel's sealed document beside the will, align the pages carefully, and take a slow breath before he said, "There is an additional clause Daniel instructed me to read only after the primary terms had been acknowledged." The room changed before the words even landed. Margaret's fingers tightened around her pen. Bradley lifted his head. Vanessa stopped moving. And for the first time since Daniel died, I felt something stronger than grief rise quietly inside me. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses, and the silence in the room became so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above us. He did not look at Margaret when he began. He did not look at Bradley. He looked at the paper Daniel had signed, the one sealed separately from the rest of the will, and read in the same steady voice he had used for every account, every trust, every careful legal phrase before it. In the event that any member of the Carter family, including but not limited to Margaret Carter, Bradley Carter, or Vanessa Carter, attempts to remove my wife, Emily Carter, from our marital residence, intimidate her into surrendering rights, restrict her access to personal property, misrepresent her position in my estate, or otherwise pressure her after my death, the following protective transfer shall immediately take effect. Bradley let out a short laugh, but it did not sound confident. It sounded like someone trying to interrupt a bad dream before it became real. "Protective transfer," he said. "What does that even mean?" Mr. Collins did not answer him directly. He continued reading. "Upon verification of such conduct, my personal shares in Carter Holdings, my voting interest attached to those shares, my separately owned investment accounts, and my full interest in the Chicago residence shall transfer to my wife, Emily Carter, without further approval from the family trustees." The room went still in a different way then. Before, the silence had been tense. Now it was stunned. Margaret's face changed first. The softness she had practiced all morning disappeared, and underneath it was something pale and hard. Her pen rolled from her fingers and tapped against the table once. Vanessa slowly lowered her phone into her lap. Bradley leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "That is absurd," he said. "Daniel could not do that. Those assets are connected to the family structure." Mr. Collins placed one finger on the document. "Some are. Some are not." Daniel was very careful about the distinction. Margaret found her voice next, but it came out thinner than before. "My son was very ill. He was vulnerable. I cannot imagine he understood the consequences of language like that." For the first time all morning, Mr. Collins looked directly at her. Daniel reviewed this clause on 3 separate occasions. His physician provided a competency letter. 2 witnesses were present. The document was executed properly under Illinois law. I sat frozen at the end of the table, feeling Daniel's ring warm against my skin beneath the chain around my neck. I had known he was protecting me, but I had not known the shape of it. I had not known he had taken their favorite words, structure, legacy, responsibility, and turned them into a shield. Mr. Collins turned the page and continued. Daniel also instructed that the clause not be discussed with Emily prior to its activation or review, in order to prevent any claim that she influenced its creation. Margaret's eyes moved to me then, searching my face for guilt, surprise, anything she could use. All she found was grief. Real grief. The kind she had never been able to imitate for more than a few seconds. Bradley pushed back his chair slightly. You keep saying verification. Verified by who? Mr. Collins opened a second folder, thicker than the first. By documented conduct occurring before and after Daniel's death. Daniel anticipated that the period immediately following his passing would reveal whether his concerns were justified. Vanessa whispered, "This is insane." But she did not sound amused anymore. Mr. Collins continued without raising his voice. The clause identifies specific examples of prohibited conduct, instructing Emily to vacate the marital home before the estate review, denying her access to Daniel's office or personal belongings without legal authority, requesting household codes or financial information outside council channels, suggesting she relocate as though her residence were already terminated, or presenting third parties to assess transition of possession before ownership is determined. Every example landed like a stone dropped in water. I saw Margaret remember the note under my door. I saw Bradley remember standing in the guest room with his clipboard. I saw Vanessa remember the apartment links she had sent with that polished little insult attached. And I remembered the foyer camera, the screenshots, the dates, the careful way Daniel had always believed truth needed a place to live. Mr. Collins lowered the document just enough to look at all of them. Daniel did not ask me to assume what you would do, he said. He asked me to wait and observe whether you would do it. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. Bradley's jaw tightened. Vanessa stared at the table. And in that moment, I understood the brilliance of what Daniel had done. He had not accused them from the grave. He had given them a choice, and they had walked straight into it. Bradley was the first to recover, or at least the first to mistake volume for control. He pushed his legal pad aside and said, "Show us the proof." His voice was sharp, but there was a thin crack beneath it that I had never heard before. Mr. Collins did not react to the tone. He simply opened the thicker folder and removed a neat stack of pages, each one labeled with dates, times, and source notes. "Of course," he said. Daniel was very specific that no transfer should occur based on emotion, assumption, or family disagreement. He required documentation. Margaret sat straighter, as though posture alone could still protect her. "Then you will find there has been a misunderstanding," she said. "We were trying to keep order during a difficult time." Mr. Collins looked down at the first page. "At 5:42 yesterday evening, in the foyer of the Chicago residence, you told Emily that she should begin packing her personal things because the property may not remain under her control." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. Mr. Collins continued, "At 5:46, Bradley Carter stated that no one was trying to be cruel and that the family wanted a smooth transition. At 5:48, Vanessa Carter told Emily it would be easier for everyone if she did not make things dramatic." Vanessa's face flushed beneath her makeup. "That was a private conversation," she said. "It was a conversation in Daniel and Emily's marital residence," Mr. Collins replied. "A residence equipped with security recording that Daniel maintained personally and lawfully." Bradley leaned forward. "You are saying Daniel recorded his own family?" Mr. Collins folded his hands. "Daniel recorded the entryways and common areas of his home. The system had been in place for years. You were all aware of it. I remember the tiny camera above the foyer, the one everyone ignored because it had always been there. Suddenly the house in my memory felt different, not haunted by Daniel, but guarded by him." Mr. Collins moved to the next document. "This is the handwritten note placed under Emily's door the following morning, instructing her to limit access to Daniel's office until estate matters were clarified." Margaret's expression hardened. That was a reasonable request. "Perhaps it would have been," Mr. Collins said, "if you had legal authority to make it. At that time, you did not." He turned another page. This is a text message from Vanessa Carter to Emily Carter, sent at 12:28 in the afternoon, containing apartment listings and the statement, "This might suit your lifestyle better once everything settles." Vanessa looked at me then, not with apology, but with the frightened anger of someone whose own words had betrayed her. "I was trying to be helpful," she said. I did not answer. I did not need to. Mr. Collins placed the final sheet on top of the stack. "And this is the property manager's appointment record, arranged by Margaret Carter, for an assessment of transition of possession at the Chicago residence, scheduled before the will was read and before any trustee determination had been made." The room seemed to shrink around them. Bradley stood halfway out of his chair, then sat back down when Mr. Collins lifted one hand calmly. "I should also inform you that Daniel included written communications from the months before his passing, including emails regarding spousal disclaimers, proposed restructuring of voting shares, and inquiries about limiting Emily's future residence rights. Those materials establish context. The conduct after his death establishes activation." Margaret's voice dropped into something cold and almost pleading. "You knew about this yesterday." Mr. Collins looked at her steadily. "Daniel instructed me to wait. He believed that if you intended to treat Emily with dignity, nothing would be triggered. He hoped I would never need this folder." For the first time, the words hurt more than they satisfied me. Because that was Daniel too. Even after everything he had heard, he had left room for them to choose decency. He had given his mother, his brother, and Vanessa one final chance to honor him by treating me like his wife. Instead, they had treated me like an obstacle before his funeral flowers had begun to wilt. Bradley rubbed both hands over his face, then muttered that they would challenge everything. Mr. Collins nodded as if he had expected that. "You are entitled to seek independent counsel. However, until a court orders otherwise, Daniel's protective transfer is valid, the Chicago residence is under Emily's control, Daniel's personal voting shares transfer to her, and no family trustee may interfere with her access, occupancy, or personal property." Vanessa whispered something I could not hear. Margaret stared at the document as though staring long enough might change Daniel's signature. I looked down at the ring against my chest and finally understood the full weight of his last gift. He had not left me a weapon. He had left me proof that I had been his family all along. No one spoke for several seconds after Mr. Collins finished explaining what Daniel's clause had done. The conference room, which had felt so controlled when I first entered, now felt like it belonged to a different story. Margaret sat with both hands resting on the table, but the confidence had drained from her face. Bradley kept staring at the folder as if the answer to undoing everything might appear between the pages. Vanessa held her phone in her lap with the screen dark, no longer pretending she had somewhere better to be. For years, they had treated silence as my weakness. That morning, silence became the only thing they had left. Mr. Collins gave them a final copy of the transfer notice and explained that any future communication regarding Daniel's estate or the Chicago residence would go through counsel. His voice remained calm, but every word closed a door. Margaret tried once more to sound like Daniel's mother instead of a woman who had lost control. "Emily," she said, turning toward me with a softness that arrived too late to be believable, "surely you understand. This is not what Daniel would have wanted. He loved his family." I looked at her carefully. I thought of Daniel as a boy in the stories he used to tell me, trying to impress his mother with perfect grades, trying to earn Bradley's respect, trying to hold together a family that measured love in loyalty to a name. Then I thought of Daniel in our kitchen, tired but smiling, telling me that I was not someone he had married into his life. I was the life he had chosen. "He did love his family," I said quietly. "That is why he gave you a chance." Margaret's eyes lowered first. Bradley started to say something, but stopped when Mr. Collins reminded him that the meeting was complete. One by one, they stood. Vanessa gathered her bag without looking at me. Bradley shoved his legal pad under his arm, his note suddenly useless. Margaret paused at the door, and for a moment I thought she might apologize, not because it would fix anything, but because Daniel deserved at least one honest sentence from her. Instead, she said, "This will divide the family." I held Daniel's ring through the fabric of my dress and answered, "No." It only revealed what was already divided. After they left, the room felt larger. Mr. Collins closed the folder and asked if I needed a moment. I nodded, though I was not sure what kind of moment could hold grief, relief, heartbreak, and gratitude all at once. He handed me a small envelope Daniel had left separately for me. My name was written on the front in his careful handwriting. Emily. Just Emily. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a short letter, no more than a page. He wrote that he hoped I would never have to hear the clause read aloud. He wrote that if I did, it meant the people who should have protected me had chosen themselves instead. He wrote that the house was mine not because of money, but because every room in it had been built with our life. And at the bottom, beneath his signature, he had written, "Do not let them convince you that peace means giving up what I left you with love." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried for the first time since walking into that office, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way grief finally escapes when it knows it is safe. That afternoon, I returned to our home alone. The hydrangeas Daniel had planted were beginning to bloom near the front steps, pale blue against the wet spring soil. Margaret's property manager was not there. Bradley's clipboard was not there. Vanessa's apartment listing sat unanswered in my phone. I walked through the foyer, past the camera they had forgotten, into the study where Daniel had spent those final Thursday mornings preparing for a future he knew he might not see. His chair was still slightly turned toward the window. His favorite pen lay beside a closed notebook. For the first time since he died, the room did not feel empty. It felt protected. I placed his letter in the top drawer with the birthday cards he had saved, then stood in the doorway and whispered, "You knew them. But you knew me better." In the weeks that followed, the Carter family did what people like them always do when consequences arrive. They hired attorneys. They made careful statements. They told friends the situation was complicated. But the documents held. The recordings held. Daniel's signature held. And so did I. I did not take joy in their humiliation. I did not throw them out with the cruelty they had shown me. I simply changed the locks, secured Daniel's office, and let Mr. Collins handle every call. Carter Holdings continued. The house remained standing. The family name survived, though not in the way Margaret wanted. As for me, I stayed in the home Daniel and I had made, not as a guest, not as an outsider, not as a woman waiting to be removed, but as his wife. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. Daniel had known it was strength. And long after everyone else thought his voice was gone, the final words he left behind spoke louder than all of them.